Bartholomew Sparrow is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin and is the author of this book, The Strategist, Brent Scowcroft and the Call of National Security. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I want to ask you the preliminary question of any author has to answer. Where did the idea come from? Why did you decide to write about this subject at this time?
I was always interested in the U.S. history and foreign policy, and I was thinking about writing a book about how we got from the end of the Cold War to where we are now, post 9/11. And I was thinking about, well, how do I cover this broad arc of history and also get at the complexities of policymaking and how different administrations administer foreign policy. And I thought, well, that would be really dry. But if there was someone who I could write about who was there for much of this time, who most people didn't know very much about, then that would be a great entree. And so that's why I chose Scowcroft.
You know, there's an old adage about personalizing the universal. And so you found a protagonist for your story.
Yeah.
And I understand you write that he was initially skeptical about the project, but then he warmed up to it. And how did that go?
Well, he didn't know who I was. He was saying, "Who's the Sparrow character?" He didn't know who I was, and so I kind of had to explain that I knew what had gone on in the Cold War and China and Panama and kind of all the events of late 20th century, early 21st century history, and explain why I would be a good a biographer for him, and that it was important. Now that I approached him, he was in his mid-80s. It was or early mid-80s, and it was an important time to mark some of this down and tell the story. And he I think he realized that he wasn't going to tell his own story, and so because he's just so modest, and so he was very helpful and willing to talk to me about 40 times about
extended discussions.
Yeah, extended discussions and interviews, and sometimes I'd come back to the same question and elaborating on things that the archival records or that other sources only gave me some sense of, and a lot of stuff I just couldn't get any information about, like his childhood, for example, or some of what it was like in the military when he was an Air Force officer. So I needed this to flesh out the story.
And since the book is now completed and on the shelves, has he had a chance to read it and get back to you with his opinion?
He hasn't yet, but a friend of his told him that he very much liked it, and that so he's I think he's glad of that, and I think he'll read it eventually. But I think it'd be weird reading one's own biography, so we'll see. But he probably doesn't recognize himself.
And I know this is a difficult thing to do, and you mentioned about the fact someone that isn't a headliner that everyone knows. Certainly people who understand foreign policy and American politics know Brent Scowcroft, but to the general public, not someone. If you were going to do some sort of ranking of most influential figures in the crafting of American policy and the foreign policy and the execution of American foreign policy over the past several decades, where does he rank?
I think he ranks right up there, because one of the points I make about calling him the strategist is that he's there for about 4 different administrations. He works very closely with Nixon, with Ford, with George H.W. Bush, and then with George W. Bush, where he's the chair of the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And so he's there throughout these different administrations. And he also works very closely with Reagan and during the MX missile crisis, and he's with the Tower Commission about investigating the Iran-Contra scandal. And he's weighing in importantly there. And so the longevity and the fact that he's there at the end of the Cold War, he's there after Tiananmen Square, he's there for the reunification of Germany, he's there, he's the foremost advocate of making sure that Iraq leaves Kuwait after the invasion of 1990. In all these ways, he's had really a great deal of influence, but he doesn't toot his own horn. And so people don't know that much about him.
About that, you list 3 qualities that you identified that you think made him successful. Integrity, one, something that has been called multivocality, an ability to speak to different audiences.
Yeah.
And then his quiet personality.
Yeah.
Can I get you to comment on these essential qualities?
Yeah. Well, his quiet personality, I'll start in reverse order. His quiet personality is just that he's respectful of other people, and he has no agenda but the president's or the United States. And so he's really enabler. He's really interested in the end objective. He's not interested in particular ideology or particular partisan position. Rather, he's really interested in affecting policy and making sure that the United States made good policy. The multivocality reflects the fact that he's this military affairs expert, that he knows ICBMs and rockets and strategic weapons, that he can talk to foreign policy folks, that he's read international history, that he's published in foreign policy journals, and then the fact that he comes from a business background and business consultant, so he knows about finance and economics and so forth. So the fact that he can know about joint operations, the facts he knows about MIRV warheads, the fact that he knows about intelligence things, all these things make him uniquely credible and able to span these different groups that make up part of the national security policy-making process. And his integrity is such that he's, you know, he tells it like it is. I mean, he does it quietly, and he doesn't insist on his own point of view, but he's thorough, he's very serious, and he's, as he said, he's respectful of other people, and you know, he doesn't mislead. And
you see him. You know, he's been here at the Wilson Center several times. I've had the opportunity to interview him, and there are certain people in this town, and it's a very short list, and that seem universally respected. People just respond to them with a certain amount of reverence, and he's certainly one of those rarities. Henry Kissinger, a mentor?
He is in part, yeah. When Scowcroft first started working for Nixon, he worked he first started working as a military advisor, and then he was deputy national security advisor under Kissinger. And in that time, Kissinger mentored him about things such as working with media and journalists, because Scowcroft hadn't had much experience on that, but especially about foreign policy and diplomacy. Scowcroft had a good sense of that already because he'd served overseas in Yugoslavia and he'd studied world history, but he hadn't had much sort of real political experience. And so he got to travel with Kissinger and oftentimes and became aware of sort of how you put together the different pieces of international relations and how foreign policy has these different effects and outcomes and inputs, and you have to kind of calibrate all of these things. And Kissinger was very good at that, at seeing these kind of overall patterns and seeing these pieces, and Scowcroft, I think, got some of that from Kissinger.
So we're talking about someone who has been part of the scene for almost half a century.
Yeah.
And was there a low point for Brent Scowcroft? Would it be the fallout with Bush 43? What would
I would say possibly that. I think several low points. I mean, one was his crash when he almost died, and then a month after airplane crash when he was just a second lieutenant with the Army Air Corps, and a month after he's hospitalized, he spends 2 years in the hospitals. His father dies, and he looked up to his father. They had a very close family, and he has to sort of. Now he can't be a pilot anymore because the crash. He wasn't going to be a pilot anymore, although he did keep flying, and like his family business that was in question because his father died, and so he really was kind of at a bit of a loss. And so, but he decided he wanted to become a defense intellectual and really wanted to weigh in and have an influence on foreign policy, and so that was one low point. Another was, I think maybe when Gerald Ford lost, when they didn't get re-elected, and they lost against then President Carter, and I think he thought that was really preventable. That Ford was very capable, but and a very good public servant, very knowledgeable of the law, very knowledgeable of the budget. That they had a good foreign policy, but they were in such a hole because of the pardon, because of Watergate, because of Vietnam. And it just gave them, too much to dig out of it. And of course, Carter was a fresh face and a fresh message.
What about a high point?
High point, I think, was probably the reunification of Germany under NATO. The fact that you could have this formally split powers, in some ways, exemplified the Cold War, East and West Germany, peacefully reuniting under the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Dramatic moment for Cold Warrior.
Yeah.
And is there a legacy? Is he the last of his kind? You tease that out in your final words in the book.
Well, several people said that, volunteered that to me, and no, I mean, I think there is a legacy about a selfless national service, and it's one that many people in government and around the country do, but they're not recognized. So in some ways, he's probably in the majority, and I think it's a legacy too about his ability to work with other people and to listen to people in the Treasury, listen to people in the Defense Department, in the State Department, intelligence, and to take them seriously. So this kind of respect for others that now seems all too scarce in the Capitol. But I think that's always, people are going to respect people who are respectful and who do listen and who do have their trust. And I think those qualities, those very human qualities, will always be in demand.
And with that in mind, is the Brent Scowcroft story still ongoing?
Well, yeah, he was just out in Saudi Arabia at King Abdullah's funeral, and so he's still running his business, and so still a player, and he'll be 90 next month. So,
well, thanks. This is a terrific book, Matt, and thanks for joining us today to discuss.
Well, thank you for having me. You're welcome.